In this presentation, we'll take a look at why the Moslem Empire could not maintain its hold as one of the strongest and most advanced civilizations on the planet. In the previous presentation, we've looked at the origins of Islam, how it started deep in the deserts of Arabia with the teachings of Muhammad, and how, after the death of Muhammad, the Muslim warriors swept across Central Asia, conquering the present-day territories of Iraq and Iran, even as far as Pakistan and Afghanistan, and the Muslim warriors swept across North Africa and Spain and threatened to take over the land of the Franks, or the Europeans. Muslims controlled a vast territory. They enjoyed great prosperity as Baghdad became the center of commerce for the entire world. Many Muslims today would love to return to the medieval times when Muslim thinkers and artists influenced the world and Europe wallowed in ignorance and superstition. But what happened? Why don't the Muslims today still exert cultural influence like they did back in medieval times? One of the major reasons for this is internal strife. Right from the beginning, Muslims could not keep from killing their leaders. 3 of the first 4 caliphs, the successors to Muhammad, were killed in murders or assassinations. We looked in the previous presentation how the Shia broke away from the traditional Muslims, the Sunni Muslims. Sunnah in Arabic means tradition. The Shia today do not recognize the first 3 caliphs as legitimate successors to Muhammad. Ali was the 4th caliph, but he was involved in a civil war and was killed, and his son Hussein was killed by the following caliph. The Shia today believe that Ali was the legitimate successor to Muhammad, and that the imams, or the prayer leaders who followed after Ali and Hussein, are the true successors to Muhammad. And so we can see that internal strife has always been a part of Muslim politics. For one reason or another, Muslim leaders very often suffer violent deaths. Now there were some caliphs who enjoyed long lives, such as Al-Mansur, who ruled for 30 years, and leaders like him were able to accomplish great things. It makes one wonder what the Muslims could have accomplished if more of their leaders had lived longer in peace. Now, the caliphs who ruled in Baghdad eventually lost control of the Muslim territories. The rulers of Spain, the Almoravids, established a prosperous and peaceful kingdom. They produced many great thinkers, such as Averroes and the great Jewish theologian Rambam, or Rabbi Moses ben Maimonides. After almost 1,000 years, Maimonides is still quoted and revered by Jews today as one of the great proponents of the Jewish religion. Then the caliphs lost control of North Africa to the Fatimid Empire, which was named in honor of Muhammad's daughter Fatima. And then they lost control of the land of Persia, which is Iran today. This territory was taken over by a tribe known as the Ghaznavids, because they came from a town called Ghazna in the present-day area of Afghanistan. And then in the 800s, the Turks took over the leadership of the Moslem Empire. The Turks were an Asian people who had migrated towards Europe. They were probably related to the Huns. The Turks were natural fighters, and they served in the Muslim armies and converted to Islam. The Turks took positions in government administrations, and eventually the Turks took over the office of the caliph. These were known as the Seljuk Turks. There are several different tribes of Turks. Now, these Turks provided new energy to an empire that was slowly dying out. And then in the 1100s, European Christians invaded the Middle East in a series of wars known as the Crusades. Now, the Muslims had been fighting the Christians of the Byzantine Empire since the very start of the Muslim Empire. In 1071, a Turkish army defeated a Byzantine army at Manzikert, and Christians in Europe took up the call. They were worried that Christian pilgrims were being persecuted when they visited the holy sites in Jerusalem and other places. By 1098, religious fervor had grown in Europe to the point that the kings of France and England and the Holy Roman Empire called on their knights to free the Holy Land of the infidels. An army of crusaders marched across Europe and attacked the Muslims. Along the way, of course, they pillaged and raped and killed Jews and other non-Christians. After some bloody battles, the Christian Crusaders conquered Jerusalem and killed most of the Jews in the city, if not all of them. In the ensuing years, the Crusaders established several kingdoms along the coast in what is now Israel, Lebanon, Jordan, and southeastern Turkey. I read someplace, I think it was in one of James Michener's novels, that the strongest Muslim kingdoms at that time were on the coast, and if the Europeans had allied with these Muslims, they probably could have conquered all of the Middle East region. But these Crusaders were not interested in making alliances with non-Christians. They had come to free the Holy Land from the infidel. I guess you could say that this was the Christian version of jihad, or holy war. The Crusader kingdoms lasted a couple hundred years. The Muslims eventually drove out the Christian invaders, but they left behind a lasting legacy. Many of these Crusader castles that they built are still standing today after almost 1,000 years. They serve as reminders of a time when Europe invaded the Middle East. Now, most people in the Middle East do not think fondly of the Crusader times. Many Jews think of it as a time when their people were massacred. To them, the only thing worse than the Crusades was the Holocaust, when Hitler killed 6 million Jews during World War II. Many Muslims in the Middle East feel the same way about the Crusades. That's why I couldn't believe it when President Bush made a speech shortly after 9/11 when the terrorists flew the jets into the World Trade Center buildings. He said America was going to launch a crusade against terrorism. Now, even I knew that was a bad choice of words, and I was just a first-year grad student at that time. I thought surely they have people with doctorates in world history, people who have studied the Middle East for years. Why didn't they warn him not to use the crusade word? Because that's not a nice word to the people in the Middle East. There are many people in the Middle East today who view Saladin, or Salah al-Din, as a great hero because he was the one who took back Jerusalem and forced the Christians to leave. And it may be that President Bush, as do many people in the West, think of the Crusades as a good time because the Crusades turned out very well for Europe. The knights who went to the Middle East came in contact with the great Muslim thinkers and philosophers, and they took some of this information with them when they returned to Europe. The influence of these Muslim thinkers got people in Europe to think and to learn, and eventually they established the universities, which eventually led to the Renaissance, eventually led to the predominance of Europe over the rest of the world today. So the Crusades turned out very well for Europe. And so the mighty Moslem Empire suffered several setbacks, but worse was still to come. In the 1200s, Mongol hordes swept over the Middle East. The Mongols had terrorized China years earlier. That's why the Chinese emperors built the Great Wall to try to keep the Mongols out. Unlike the Turks, the Mongols were not interested in converting to Islam. They came merely to kill and destroy. They sacked the city of Baghdad in 1258, and that city never regained its former greatness. The Mongols swept across Russia and threatened to overwhelm Europe. I think I saw someplace where there are some places in the Middle East that still have not recovered from these Mongol invasions. The Arabs and the Turks came back, and they rebuilt their civilization, they rebuilt their towns. But it was never as great as it had been in the first few centuries of the Islamic Empire. It was also in the 1300s when another tribe of Turks came into existence. These were descendants of a man named Osman, or Othman. Their numbers grew over the years, and they became known as Osmanlis, or Othmanlis, and eventually they became known as the Ottoman Turks. By the 1400s, the Ottomans had taken over most of the Anatolian Peninsula, and in 1453 they conquered the city of Constantinople. In the 1500s, the Ottomans took over Egypt, Arabia, North Africa, and most of the Middle East except for Persia. The Ottoman sultans controlled most of the Middle East, and they took the title of Caliph as the successors to Muhammad, but they imposed strict control over their subjects. The Ottomans did not inspire a renaissance of learning like the earlier caliphs did. When Europe went through its renaissance, the Middle East did not join. And that's what we'll look at in the next presentation.